The boardroom fell silent as I walked through those mahogany doors for the last time. 23 years I'd worked in that building, scrubbing floors, serving coffee, invisible to the man who sat at the head of that table. But today, everything was different. Today, I owned it all. He looked up from his papers, his face draining of color when he saw me. Not the cleaning lady anymore, not the help, but the new CEO of Harrison Industries. His mouth opened, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that would echo in that room forever. "This can't be happening. You're nobody. You're nothing." But I wasn't nothing. I was his daughter. And this is the story of how a man's hatred for his own blood came back to destroy everything he built. How did we get here? How does a father's love turn to such poisonous rejection that he'd rather watch his empire burn than acknowledge the child he helped create? This story will take you through 23 years of pain, determination, and the ultimate reckoning between a daughter who never stopped hoping and a father who never stopped hating. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I know you have countless options for how to spend your time, and the fact that you chose to be here with me means the world. If stories like this touch your heart, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today, so drop a comment below and tell me your city or country. Now let's dive into Sarah's incredible journey. Sarah Washington was 5 years old when she first asked her mother why her skin was darker than everyone else in their small Ohio town. They lived in Millfield, population 3,200, where everybody knew everybody, and secrets had a way of burning through the community like wildfire through dry grass. "Baby girl," her mother Linda would say, smoothing Sarah's thick curls with gentle fingers. "God makes us all different colors, like flowers in a garden. Some are roses, some are daisies, but we're all beautiful in his eyes." But even at 5, Sarah could see the way people looked at them, the whispers that followed them through the grocery store, the way conversations stopped when they walked into church. Linda Washington was as white as fresh snow, with blonde hair and blue eyes that sparkled when she laughed. And Sarah, well, Sarah looked nothing like her mother. Linda worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Mornings at the diner on Main Street, afternoons cleaning houses for the wealthy families on Oak Ridge, and evenings doing bookkeeping for small businesses around town. She never complained, never showed Sarah how tired she was. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would hear her mother crying in the next room. "Mama, why are you sad?" Sarah asked one evening, finding Linda sitting at their small kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills.
I'm not sad, baby. Mama's just thinking.
Thinking about what? Linda pulled Sarah onto her lap, holding her close. About how to give you the best life possible. About how to make sure you never feel like you're not good enough, no matter what anyone says. "Am I good enough, Mama?" "Oh, sweet girl," Linda whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're perfect. You're absolutely perfect." But perfection, Sarah would learn, wasn't enough in a world that had already decided her worth before she could even spell her own name. There was something Linda wasn't telling her, something that hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. And in the wealthy part of town, in a mansion on Oak Ridge, lived a man who held the key to every question Sarah had ever wondered about herself. His name was Robert Harrison, and he owned half the businesses in Millfield. The other half wanted to work for him. He was powerful, respected, and had everything a man could want, except peace of mind. Because 23 years ago, Robert Harrison had made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sarah was 12 when her mother collapsed at the diner. She'd been feeling sick for weeks, but Linda Washington wasn't the type to slow down, wasn't the type to complain. She pushed through the exhaustion, the dizzy spells, the moments when she had to grip the counter just to stay standing. "It's probably just the flu," she told Sarah. "Nothing a little rest won't cure." But it wasn't the flu. When the doctor at Millfield General finally ran the tests Linda had been putting off for months, his face told the story before his words could. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. Sarah sat in that sterile hospital room, holding her mother's hand, watching the strongest woman she'd ever known crumble before her eyes. The machines beeped steadily, marking time like a countdown to loss. "Mama, what's gonna happen to me?" Sarah whispered. Linda turned her head, her blue eyes still bright despite the pain medication. "You're gonna be fine, baby girl. You're stronger than you know. But I don't have anyone else." Linda was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on Sarah's palm. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, careful, like she was choosing each word from a collection of dangerous possibilities. Sarah, there are things about your life, about where you come from, that I never told you. What kind of things? Complicated things, adult things. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Is it about my father? Linda's grip tightened on her hand. In all of Sarah's 12 years, they'd never had this conversation. Whenever Sarah asked about her father, Linda would deflect with distractions or half-answers. He was gone. He couldn't be part of their lives. It was better this way. Your father, Linda began, then stopped. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with tears. Your father is a complicated man, Sarah. He made choices that hurt people. Choices that hurt you. What choices? He chose his reputation over his family. He chose what other people thought over what was right. Sarah's 12-year-old mind struggled to piece together the fragments. Does he live here, in Millfield? Linda nodded slowly. He lives here. He's always lived here.
Then why doesn't he want to see me?
The question hung in the air like a blade. Linda turned away, staring out the hospital window at the town she'd called home for over 30 years. The town where she'd fallen in love, gotten pregnant, and been abandoned by the man who promised to love her forever. Because, baby girl, your father is white, and he was too afraid, too proud, too concerned about what people would think to stand by us when we needed him most. Sarah felt the world shift beneath her. All those stares, all those whispers, the feeling of being different, of being wrong somehow, suddenly made terrible sense. Who is he, Mama? Linda closed her eyes. His name is Robert Harrison. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Robert Harrison, the man whose mansion she walked past every day on the way to school. The man whose name was on half the buildings in town. The man who employed half their neighbors and owned the other half's mortgages. The rich man, the one with the big house. Yes, he's my father. Yes. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. Does he know about me? Linda's laugh was bitter, broken. Oh, he knows, baby. He's always known. Linda Washington died on a Tuesday in November, when the Ohio leaves had turned the color of fire and the first snow was threatening on the horizon. Sarah, now 13 and suddenly alone in the world, sat in the front pew of Millfield Methodist Church, watching neighbors and friends file past her mother's casket. Mrs. Henderson from the diner cried openly. The Peterson family, whose house Linda had cleaned for 8 years, brought flowers. Even old Mr. Garcia from the hardware store showed up, hat in hand, eyes red with unshed tears. But Robert Harrison didn't come. The man who had helped create her, who shared her DNA, who lived less than 2 miles away, couldn't be bothered to attend the funeral of the woman who had raised his child alone. After the service, Mrs. Henderson took Sarah aside. Betty Henderson was 63, had worked at the diner for 20 years, and had watched Linda struggle through single motherhood with a mixture of admiration, and heartbreak.
Honey, you know you can't stay in that apartment by yourself.
Sarah nodded. She'd been dreading this conversation, but she knew it was coming. I know. I've called social services. There's a nice family in Columbus who might be able to take you in. I don't want to leave Millfield. Mrs. Henderson's face softened. Baby, there's nothing left for you here. But Sarah disagreed. There was something left for her in Millfield. There was a father who owed her 13 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, scraped knees that needed bandaging, and bedtime stories that needed reading. There was a man who needed to look her in the eye and explain why his comfort had been more important than her existence. That night, instead of packing for Columbus, Sarah walked through the quiet streets of Millfield to Oak Ridge Avenue. The Harrison mansion sat on 2 acres of perfectly manicured lawn, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the November darkness. Through the front window, she could see a family gathering around a dinner table. Robert Harrison, his wife Margaret, and their 2 children, Robert Jr. and Elizabeth. Sarah stood at the edge of the property, watching her half-siblings laugh at something their father said. The scene was everything she'd dreamed of as a child. Family dinners, a father who came home every night, a mother who didn't work 3 jobs just to pay rent. It was the life she should have had. She walked up the circular driveway, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the sound of her footsteps on the gravel. The front door was massive, solid oak with stained glass windows that cast colored shadows on the porch. Sarah raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What would she say? Hi, I'm your daughter? The one you pretended didn't exist? The one whose mother just died while you sat in your mansion pretending we were never your responsibility? And before she could lose her nerve, Sarah knocked 3 times. The door opened and Robert Harrison stood before her. He was tall, probably 6'2", with silver hair and green eyes that Sarah recognized because she saw them in the mirror every morning. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He knew exactly who she was, and she knew that he knew. "What do you want?" His voice was cold, controlled. "I'm Sarah Washington. I know who you are. My mother died yesterday." Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify. Pain? Regret? Relief? "I heard. I'm your daughter." Robert Harrison looked over her shoulder, checking to see if any neighbors were watching. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "You are not my daughter. I don't know what lies your mother told you, but I am not your father." Sarah felt like she'd been slapped. "She told me your mother was troubled. She worked for my wife, cleaning our house, and she developed some kind of obsession. She made up stories, created fantasies." "That's not true."
I have a family, Sarah. A real family. I have children, and a wife, and a life that doesn't include you.
The door closed in her face with a soft click that might as well have been thunder. Sarah stood on that porch for 10 minutes, staring at the door, waiting for it to open again, waiting for him to change his mind, to remember that she was a child who had just lost everything. But the door stayed closed, and eventually Sarah walked back down the driveway and into a life where she would have to save herself. The foster home in Columbus was temporary, they told her, just until they could find something more permanent. Sarah lived there for 6 months, sharing a room with 2 other girls, keeping her head down and planning. At 14, she applied for emancipation. The process was complicated, required lawyers and court appearances and more paperwork than any teenager should have to navigate. But Sarah was determined. She'd been taking care of herself emotionally for years anyway, and with the small inheritance her mother had left, plus the part-time job she'd managed to land at a local grocery store, she could prove financial independence. The judge who granted her emancipation was a kind woman named Dorothy Chen, who seemed to understand that some children are forced to grow up faster than nature intended. "Are you sure about this, Sarah? Foster care isn't perfect, but it provides structure, support." "Your Honor, I've been supporting myself since I was 12. This just makes it legal." Judge Shen signed the papers, but not before giving Sarah her card. "If you ever need anything, any kind of help, you call me. Promise?" Sarah promised, though she had no intention of needing help from anyone ever again. She moved back to Millfield and rented a tiny apartment above the hardware store. Mr. Garcia, who had known her mother, gave her a job and asked no questions about why a 14-year-old was living alone. Sarah worked after school, on weekends, and during every vacation. She saved every penny, studied every night, and watched. She watched Robert Harrison drive through town in his black Mercedes. She watched him at church on Sundays, sitting in the 3rd pew with his perfect family. She watched him at the annual Millfield Founders Day celebration, giving speeches about community and responsibility while carefully avoiding eye contact with the girl who served him coffee at the hardware store's adjoining cafe. By the time Sarah was 16, she had saved $8,000 and had been accepted to Ohio State University with a partial academic scholarship. She was valedictorian of her high school class, though Robert Harrison, who served on the school board, managed to be absent the night she gave her graduation speech. She left Millfield for Columbus that fall, but she never stopped watching. She studied business and economics, graduating summa cum laude in 3 years instead of 4. She applied to Harvard Business School and got in with a full scholarship. She spent her summers working internships at Fortune 500 companies, learning how business really worked, how money moved, how power was built and maintained. At Harvard, she met James Chen, a brilliant economics student whose aunt happened to be a judge in Columbus. They fell in love over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of changing the world. James was the first person Sarah had ever told the complete truth about her childhood, about Robert Harrison, about the door that had closed in her face when she was 13 years old. "You could sue him," James said one night as they walked through Harvard Yard. "For child support, at minimum. I don't want his money." "Then what do you want?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her mother working 3 jobs, about the apartment above the hardware store, about the door closing in her face. "I want him to understand what it costs to throw people away." After Harvard, Sarah moved to New York and took a job with Goldman Sachs. She was 22 years old, brilliant and hungry for success in a way that made her colleagues nervous. She worked 100-hour weeks, closed deals that other analysts couldn't figure out, and saved every bonus, every commission, every dollar she could get her hands on. By 25, she had moved to a smaller investment firm where she could have more control over her accounts. By 28, she was managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. By 30, she had started her own firm. Washington Capital was small but fierce, specializing in hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring. Sarah had a reputation for finding undervalued companies and either fixing them or dismantling them for parts. She was ruthless, efficient, and very, very good at what she did. But she never forgot about Millfield, Ohio. She never forgot about Harrison Industries, the company that had made Robert Harrison rich and powerful, and too good to acknowledge his own daughter. She hired private investigators to study Harrison Industries' financial situation. She analyzed their quarterly reports, their debt structures, their market position. She watched and waited and planned. Harrison Industries was vulnerable. Robert Harrison, now in his 60s, had made some bad investments in the early 2000s. The company was over-leveraged, dependent on a few major contracts, and not adapting well to changes in their industry. They were successful enough to keep up appearances, but not strong enough to survive a sustained attack from someone who understood their weaknesses. Sarah began buying Harrison Industries stock through shell companies and intermediaries. Small amounts at first, nothing that would trigger attention. She acquired debt instruments tied to their major contracts. She quietly approached their biggest clients with better offers through other companies she controlled. It took 3 years, but slowly, systematically, Sarah Washington began to squeeze the life out of Harrison Industries. The first sign of trouble came on a Wednesday morning in March. Robert Harrison arrived at his office to find his CFO, Patricia Williams, waiting with a stack of reports and a worried expression. "Robert, we need to talk." Patricia had been with Harrison Industries for 15 years. She was competent, loyal, and not prone to panic. When she looked worried, there was usually good reason. "What's going on?" "Someone's been buying our stock. Quietly, through multiple entities, but when you add it all up, they've acquired about 12% of the company." Robert sat down heavily in his leather chair. 12%? How is that possible without triggering disclosure requirements? They've been very careful to stay under the reporting thresholds. But Robert, that's not the worst part. What's the worst part? The Jameson contract fell through yesterday. They're going with a competitor. And this morning, I got a call from Morrison Industries. They're considering switching vendors too. Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Jameson and Morrison contracts represented almost 40% of Harrison Industries' revenue. Without them, the company would be in serious trouble. Did they say why? Better terms from a competitor. Significantly better terms. Who's the competitor? Patricia consulted her notes. A company called Washington Capital. The name hit Robert like a physical blow. Washington. As in Linda Washington, the woman who had cleaned his house 23 years ago. The woman who had claimed he was the father of her mixed-race daughter. The woman who had died of cancer when her daughter was barely a teenager. But that was impossible. That girl, Sarah, she would be in her 30s now. But she was nobody. She had grown up poor, probably never even went to college. There was no way she could be behind a sophisticated financial attack on his company. Robert spent the rest of the day making phone calls, trying to save the Morrison contract, trying to understand what was happening to his carefully controlled world. By 5 o'clock, he had answers, but they weren't the answers he wanted. Washington Capital was owned by Sarah Washington, age 32, Harvard MBA, former Goldman Sachs analyst. She was worth approximately $50 million and had a reputation for hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring. She was also, according to the private investigator Robert hired that afternoon, definitely his daughter. The DNA test he'd refused to take 20 years ago was no longer necessary. Sarah Washington had built a life, a career, and a fortune that looked exactly like what Robert Harrison's daughter should have accomplished. She had his eyes, his intelligence, his ruthless determination, and his talent for business. She also, apparently, had his company in her crosshairs. That evening, Robert drove to the small apartment complex on the outskirts of Millfield, where his mother, now 86 and living in assisted living, spent her days watching game shows and complaining about the food. "Mom, I need to ask you something." Eleanor Harrison looked up from her crossword puzzle. Even at 86, she was sharp as a tack and twice as cutting. This is about that Washington girl, isn't it? Robert was startled. How did you—
Oh, please. You think I don't know what's going on in my own town? That girl's been making waves for years. Harvard Business School, big shot in New York. Now she's back to cause trouble.
Did you know about Linda? About the baby? Eleanor set down her crossword and looked at her son with disappointment that had been brewing for over 20 years. Of course I knew. Linda Washington came to me when she was pregnant, scared out of her mind, broke and desperately in love with my stupid son. What did you tell her? I told her to tell you. I told her you had a right to know, and she had a right to support. She tried, Robert. She tried multiple times. You were too busy protecting your precious reputation to listen. Robert felt the ground shifting beneath him. But the baby, she wasn't mine. Eleanor's laugh was harsh. Wasn't yours. Robert, I've seen that girl around town for years. She looks exactly like you did at her age. She has your eyes, your stubborn chin, your way of thinking 10 steps ahead of everyone else. I have a family. You had a family, you chose to ignore part of it, and now that part is coming back to destroy what you built. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice sharp with decades of suppressed anger. You want to know what Linda Washington told me the last time I saw her? She was dying, Robert, dying of cancer, and she came to me to ask if I would look out for Sarah after she was gone.
What did you tell her?
I told her I'd try, but I also told her that my son was a coward who cared more about what the neighbors thought than about doing right by his own blood. Robert left the assisted living facility feeling like he'd been hollowed out with a spoon. Everything he thought he knew about the past 20 years was wrong. Everything he'd told himself about Linda Washington, about Sarah, about his own choices, was a lie he'd built to protect himself from the truth. The truth was that he had a daughter. A brilliant, successful, powerful daughter who had every reason to hate him, and who now had the resources to destroy everything he'd built. And the worst part was, she was absolutely right to do it. Sarah Washington returned to Millfield on a Sunday in April, driving a silver Tesla Model S that cost more than most people in town made in 2 years. She checked into the Millfield Inn, the nicest hotel in town, and spent the evening walking the streets of her childhood. Everything looked smaller than she remembered. The diner where her mother had worked looked shabby and dated. The hardware store where she'd lived above Mr. Garcia's office seemed cramped and dark. Even the Harrison mansion, which had seemed impossibly grand when she was 13, now looked like exactly what it was. A big house in a small town, trying too hard to impress people who didn't matter. Monday morning, Sarah walked into the offices of Harrison Industries wearing a black suit that cost more than her mother had made in a month. The receptionist, a young woman named Jessica who had graduated high school 2 years behind Sarah, recognized her immediately. Sarah Washington? Oh my God, I heard you were some big shot in New York now. I'm here to see Mr. Harrison. Do you have an appointment? Tell him Sarah Washington is here. He'll see me. Jessica made the call, and within minutes, Patricia Williams appeared in the lobby. Patricia had aged in the 3 years since Sarah had begun her campaign against Harrison Industries. She looked tired, worried, and defeated. Miss Washington, Mr. Harrison is in a meeting. No, he's not. Sarah's voice was calm, professional. He's sitting in his office trying to figure out how to save his company. Tell him I'm here to discuss terms. Patricia disappeared for several minutes, then returned. He'll see you now. Sarah followed Patricia through hallways lined with photographs of Harrison Industries' greatest accomplishments. Groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, civic awards, 23 years of success, built on the foundation of a lie. Robert Harrison's office was exactly what Sarah had expected. Massive mahogany desk, leather chairs, walls lined with degrees and awards, and photographs of Robert with various politicians and business leaders. He stood when she entered, and Sarah was struck by how much older he looked than she'd expected. He was 64 now, with more gray in his hair, and lines around his eyes that spoke of recent stress. Sarah, Mr. Harrison. They stood there for a moment, father and daughter, studying each other across a chasm of 20 years of silence. You look like your mother, Robert said finally.
I look like you?
Robert gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. Please, sit. Sarah remained standing. I'll make this simple. I now own 38% of Harrison Industries. I control 2 of your major contracts, and hold the debt on a 3rd. I can destroy this company whenever I choose. What do you want? I want you to answer one question honestly. Robert nodded. When you closed that door in my face 20 years ago, When you told me I wasn't your daughter, did you believe that was true? Or did you know exactly who I was and decide I wasn't worth the inconvenience? The question hung in the air between them. Robert sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 64 years. I knew, he said quietly. I knew from the moment your mother told me she was pregnant. Then why? Robert was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the town he'd spent his entire life trying to impress. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what people would think. Afraid of what it would do to my marriage, my reputation, my family. I told myself that you were better off without me, that Linda was strong enough to raise you alone, that I could just pretend it never happened. And did it work? Did pretending make it go away? No. Robert looked at her then, and Sarah saw something she'd never expected to see in his eyes. Regret. Deep, bone-deep regret that had been eating at him for 20 years. Not a day went by that I didn't think about you. Not a day that I didn't wonder what kind of person you were becoming, whether you were happy, whether you were safe. But you never did anything about it. I was a coward. I am a coward. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. She had spent 20 years imagining this conversation, and it had never gone like this. In her imagination, Robert Harrison was defiant, unrepentant, full of excuses and justifications. She had never imagined him sitting behind his desk looking broken. Your mother, Robert continued, she was the strongest person I ever knew, and the kindest. She deserved so much better than what I gave her. She died believing you were ashamed of me. Robert closed his eyes. I was never ashamed of you. I was ashamed of myself. That's not good enough. I know. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the town where she'd grown up, feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. I could take everything from you. I could leave you with nothing. I know.
Is that what you want? Do you want me to destroy everything you've built?
Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then, what I want is to go back 20 years and make different choices. What I want is to have been the kind of man your mother deserved, the kind of father you deserved. But I can't do that. No, you can't.
So what happens now?
Sarah turned back to face him. Now you have to live with what you chose, and I have to decide whether revenge is worth more to me than peace. She walked toward the door, then stopped. I'll let you know what I decide. Sarah spent that evening at her mother's grave in Millfield Cemetery. The headstone was simple. Linda Washington, beloved mother, 1965-2008. Sarah had paid for it herself when she was 16, working extra shifts at the hardware store to afford the granite marker. She sat in the grass next to the grave and told her mother about the conversation with Robert, about the business empire she'd built, about the choice she now faced. I did it, Mama. I became successful enough to hurt him the way he hurt us. But now that I'm here, now that I have the power to destroy him, I don't know if that's what you would want me to do. The wind rustled through the oak trees that surrounded the cemetery, and Sarah could almost hear her mother's voice. Baby girl, revenge might feel good for a moment, but it won't heal the hurt. Only forgiveness can do that. The next morning, Sarah returned to Harrison Industries. This time, she didn't go to Robert's office. Instead, she asked Patricia Williams to call a meeting of the board of directors. At 10 o'clock, Sarah walked into the boardroom, where she'd imagined this confrontation 1,000 times. Robert Harrison sat at the head of the table, flanked by the 6 other board members who had built their careers on his success. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, my name is Sarah Washington, and I now control a majority stake in Harrison Industries. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Robert sat quietly, watching his daughter take control of his company with the same ruthless efficiency he'd once used to build it. I'm here to announce several changes. First, effective immediately, Robert Harrison will step down as CEO. He will retain a position on the board and continue to receive his pension, but operational control of the company will transfer to new management. One of the board members, an older man named Frank Morrison, spoke up. Ms. Washington, with all due respect, what are your qualifications to run this company?
Sarah smiled. Harvard MBA, 15 years of experience in corporate finance and restructuring, and a personal understanding of what this company represents that none of you could possibly match. She turned to Robert. Second, Harrison Industries will establish a scholarship fund for underprivileged students in Millfield. The fund will be endowed with $2 million annually and will be administered by a committee that includes representatives from the community. Robert nodded slowly. And third,
You're going to learn what it means to work for someone else's vision instead of your own. You're going to see what it's like when your security depends on someone else's goodwill. Sarah gathered her papers and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back one more time. I'm not doing this to destroy you, Mr. Harrison. I'm doing this to save what's left of both of us. 6 months later, Harrison Industries was more profitable than it had ever been under Robert's leadership. Sarah had streamlined operations, diversified the client base, and brought in new contracts that secured the company's future for decades. Robert Harrison, now serving as senior advisor rather than CEO, found himself in the strange position of working for his daughter. She was demanding, brilliant, and absolutely unforgiving of mediocrity. She was also, he realized with a mixture of pride and regret, exactly the kind of leader he had always hoped to be. They never had the tearful reunion that movies promised. They never became the close father-daughter team that might have been possible if Robert had made different choices 20 years earlier. But they found something else, something harder earned and more honest. They found respect. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the office was quiet and they were the only two people left in the building, Robert would catch glimpses of the little girl who had knocked on his door when she was 13 years old. The girl who had needed a father and gotten a closed door instead. He couldn't change what he had done. He couldn't give her back the childhood she deserved or the father she needed. But he could show up every day and do the work, prove that he was finally ready to be the man she had needed him to be. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't the happy ending that fairy tales promised. But for Sarah Washington, who had spent her entire life learning to save herself, it was something perhaps more valuable. It was enough. The last time I saw Sarah Washington, she was standing in that same boardroom where this story began, leading a meeting about the company's expansion into renewable energy. Robert Harrison sat at her right hand, taking notes and offering suggestions when asked. He looked older, humbler, but also somehow more solid than the man who had closed his door 20 years earlier. After the meeting, I asked Sarah if she had gotten what she came for. She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the town where she'd grown up, feeling like she didn't belong. I came here for revenge, she said finally, but what I found instead was the possibility of something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Family. Not the kind you're born into, but the kind you choose to build, piece by piece, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when you're not sure it's worth the effort. She turned back to me with a smile that looked exactly like her mother's. Turns out that's worth more than revenge ever could have been. Would you want to know the truth, if it could shatter your world? Would you choose forgiveness over revenge, if you had the power to destroy the person who hurt you most? Sometimes the most powerful victory isn't in tearing someone down, but in building something better from the pieces they left behind. This is Sarah Washington's story, a story of a daughter who refused to be denied, a father who learned too late what love really costs, and the truth that some doors, once closed, can only be opened from the inside.